Hey, welcome back. Today we are going to be digging through some history and especially looking at kind of that, the American idea of slavery.
Yeah, truly, we're going to concentrate on the United States today, up to right prior to the Civil War. Depending on how far we get and what we talk about. But yes, that's the goal is to talk about from right before the Revolution to right before the Civil War. Talk about that peculiar institution and how it develops and how it changes, and more importantly, how it poisoned the politics of America.
Well, and especially if you look here on the map that is behind us here, and this is something that I've used in classes that I've taught multiple times. It's really the roots of the Civil War. How do you define it? And by ultimately the founding of our colonies and the 1600s.
All the northern colonies are done by the end of the 1600s.
And we'll have another map that talks about that here in just a little bit. But again, you're already starting to see a major separation, especially here between your northern states, where they're looking mostly at factories in the later half of the 1700s, and then moving into, again, the increase in population, and of course your southern states where they're going to be focused heavily on agriculture. The West will come in later when we talk after that opening of the West by about the 1820s. We'll see some major changes there. But again, the roots of the Civil War ultimately reside in this idea of slavery. Mm-hmm.
There's particularly black slavery.
Right. There's no rhyme or reason about it.
Yeah. Well, you can dance around other issues that some are pertinent.
Right.
But most of them don't really have much bearing, and nobody would have went to a war over them.
I mean, the states' rights issue, that's been something that's going on in American history, well, even world history, if you will, for some time.
Well, I think the concept of states' rights as a tension between the federal government and the states is a feature of our Constitution. It's kind of like the tension between the executive and the legislative branch.
Yeah.
It's built into the system to prevent one side from becoming too powerful.
Of course.
Everything about our Constitution is to limit power of government.
Well, that's what the 9th and 10th Amendment is about.
Exactly.
So
they both speak directly to that. I'm not sure why.
Well,
because nobody pays attention to
exactly. Nobody really cares much about it. But
I mean, what you talk about, the difference between North and South. The West comes later.
Yes.
So if we start with the North and the South, in the North, I guess the agriculture thing is kind of a misnomer, because America was an agricultural country well into the 1900s.
That's true.
The vast majority of people lived in the country.
Mm-hmm.
They were farmers or related to farm industry in some direct fashion.
Right.
Not like today, where it's less than 5% of people live in rural or participate in farming.
It was literally an exact opposite.
Yeah.
5% of the people lived in a population center greater than 10,000?
Yeah. And of course, my father came from Philadelphia, visiting Philadelphia and seeing Philadelphia is a spread out, huge area. When you look at the map of what revolutionary Philadelphia was, it's a tiny portion of the modern city.
I'm sure.
It was surrounded by farms.
Right.
And things. When you look in the North, the ideal for the North is, because of the way the terrain is, somewhat rocky, very isolated, it's all built on small family farms.
Right.
40 to 100 acres, takes a long time and extra labor, but not permanent labor.
Right.
You only need extra help during planting and harvest, and maybe not even during planting as we move into the Industrial Revolution and some of those cool machines come out to help.
Right.
But you don't need 10 extra people on your farm all year round to do all the labor that needs to be done. You just need you and 2 or 3 hired people in, say, October.
Yeah, and maybe not even that. If you have a big enough family,
you
really don't even need a hired hand.
If you have a bunch of children, who in the North also tend to live Another one of those interesting social demographics is in the North, most children knew their grandparents.
Right.
Which is not something we see in the South.
Yeah.
Because of malaria and all the other things that come with living in the South without air conditioning, which is a horrible, horrible concept.
I can't imagine. I mean, no,
can't.
thank you.
No, I just visited in both Florida and Texas, and they were both hot, hot, hot.
And so the thing that we have to think about, of course, from the beginning, I mean, of course, we know the first of these settlements came in, 1608, is that right?
1607 for Jamestown.
Right. Jamestown.
1620 for Plymouth.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just start rapid fire after that.
Right, and so the thing is, you'll notice, of course, Jamestown is down here in Virginia, along the James River, obviously.
Surprise.
And then you have Plymouth here in northern parts of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which will eventually become the Massachusetts Bay Colony, I'm sorry. But the idea is, again, these are obviously two vastly different areas.
Well, of course, different settlement reasons.
Right.
Jamestown is settled, for all those who love Pocahontas. They're there to find gold. Secondarily, probably for the crown, is to establish a place where they can raid Spanish shipping.
Right.
Which the Spanish are well aware of, and maybe one of the reasons that the Roanoke colony, a little farther south,
just right about
went. But these are not really people who are thinking about permanent settlement.
No.
They want to come to the New World and get rich. Very similar to what we talked about in South America and Caribbean.
Right.
With the Spanish and the French. They come in, they want to make their wealth and go home.
Yeah.
100 years later, you start having these generational families that have lived there their whole life and don't really care about going home except maybe to visit.
And then that's the thing again with like what we mentioned, the Roanoke colony, one of the first, and it's not even an established colony because it only lasted for what, 2 years? Yeah, and of course that was a blip on the radar screen. Because again, it was there maybe to establish some type of a permanent settlement, but it doesn't work. It doesn't focus on getting that settlement going because, well, of course, you don't have enough area to farm. You're in sandy,
and you're on an island.
Yeah, you're on an island. You're literally in the middle of nowhere. So,
and in both cases, Jamestown and Plymouth, they both are settled into a dead zone.
Right.
Places where the native tribes had shrunk or disappeared, and so they were in an empty area. They had a tribe adjacent, but they weren't landing directly on Native American soil. That caused conflict immediately.
Right. You hear of the Powhatans.
Yes.
And Squanto and that idea of Thanksgiving.
Right. But they didn't have a lot of reason for conflict.
No.
And then of course once the natives saw what the Pilgrims brought, there was plenty of opportunity for trade.
Of course.
Food for finished goods.
Right.
Which becomes a theme as we move across the West. Really.
Yes.
Whether it's for buffalo hides or meat or whatever in exchange for finished goods, that becomes the trade standard all through American history with Native Americans.
So this westward change, going in with that transition period again that we talked about last time, the thing that we really need to focus on again is that there is this westward transition, whether it be from England and the continent of Europe over to the North American colonies, or just transitioning between North and South. It's there. It's eventually going to come up. And so when we move on to our next little section, we want to focus here again on the idea of just the colonies themselves. How are these colonies coming about? What is the purpose of them? How do they work? Why are they there? Well, when it comes to, again, most of your northern colonies, they're mostly proprietary colonies.
Well, yeah, especially, what we consider the basis of New England, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, there are almost religious colonies more than anything else. People who don't agree with the Church of England have found a way usually money to the crown in some fashion, to get out of the king's hair
Right.
and move to the New World. Pennsylvania, kind of the same idea. Quaker, not enough Quakers to have their own colony, so they practice, really in the New World, probably the first real example of religious toleration, because there are not enough Quakers to dominate a state.
Right.
And so they have a little, luckily of course, William Penn's dad loaned the crown a lot of money, and so to get it paid off, Willie just took Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Which seems like I guess a fair trade in long run.
Right. I don't know about you, but I'd like to just, hey.
Have a big chunk of land, and then
There
of
you
course, the Anglo-Dutch Wars result in New Amsterdam becoming New York.
Mhm.
Maryland, of course, also another religious-based colony
A Catholic.
with a Catholic. Same reasoning
Right.
though.
Right.
Doesn't want to be part of the Church of England because he's Catholic, but knows that he can't enforce Catholicism in Maryland. So it becomes another state that has a much more broad religious spectrum that you don't see in Massachusetts,
Sure.
or especially, well, Rhode Island is fairly wide open too, but that's just because the guy who founds it is pretty wide open in his
Right.
mind.
Roger Williams is.
But I guess the thing is, before we get too deep into the colonies,
Right.
because that's another whole episode,
Right.
that we
Right,
have
right.
planned,
Right.
is that difference between North and South.
Mm-hmm.
The North has the small family farms, small craftsmen in the cities. They don't really have a call for a lot of slave labor. Yes, the wealthier do import them for the same reasons wealthy have always had servants to take care of the household chores and let the master and mistress of the house have more free time and ability to be involved in social and political things
Right.
without worrying about cutting firewood or washing dishes and all those other menial tasks that everybody likes to give to somebody else. That's why people have large families, to
Of
give
course.
a lot of those jobs that just take up a lot of time and don't require really a lot of skill, but that works there. In the South, however, you have that money based, like we
Right.
talked about with Jamestown. The people
Right.
who came there wanted to get rich.
Right. And so specifically looking at some of these places on the map, as you'll see, those major areas where many of those slaves did come in. Of course, New York Harbor, you know, major center of commercial enterprise, where you see again the development of many of your factories in the later part of the 18th century and into the 19th century, and of course Philadelphia being a big port city as well.
Well, largest city in the colonies
Right.
until they weren't colonies, and
Yeah.
then for a while after.
Right. And then when you look at it, yes, Boston is there, but they're not as big a center of trade as they could be.
Well, they don't have any connections to the other colonies.
Right.
They're really isolated by the mountains to the west,
Mhm.
which aren't very vigorous mountains in like a Rocky Mountain sense,
More like hills.
but well enough to stop people who are running in wagons without springs on their. And it just it doesn't lend itself. It's much easier to move things by boat to New York and send it up the Hudson River
Right.
than it is to send it overland from Boston. So, yeah, you don't see that direct connection to the hinterlands
Right.
with Boston and that area.
And so as we talk about again with the South, many of those southern colonies, southern plantation lands, especially here Charleston. Charleston, of course, being the biggest of these port cities in the South.
Oh yeah.
And that's where you're going to see a large number of those slaves coming in. And I mean, that's early on. Again,
Probably, what, 2/3
at least,
of all slaves
at
come
least.
through the Carolinas.
Right. And we mentioned this before, and it's not even North Carolina, even really.
Yeah, well, yeah,
And it's
true.
mostly South Carolina. You may have southern portions of North Carolina be a part of this, but most of it, South Carolina's the guy, the one.
Well, really, if you look at a map today, most of North Carolina's population is towards the south.
Right.
You get up into the mountains, the Piedmont area.
Mm-hmm.
We go into small farms. We almost look like New England, except with a lot more heat.
Yeah.
But this is where you have this weird tension, which we'll talk about as we get later, between poor whites and plantation owners.
Yes,
which
well.
is a very important thing. But you know, this cultural and economic difference between North and South solidifies slavery in the South,
Of course.
because it needs intensive, large amounts of labor.
Well, when your only major crop
well,
for most of your existence is beyond cotton.
Mhm.
I mean, cotton is the big one, no doubt. It's why it's called King Cotton.
Yes.
But they also have indigo, they have rice, sorghum, which is still labor intensive in trying to cultivate.
Well, so is tobacco.
Right.
And tobacco is their moneymaker. That's what kicks off these colonies.
Yeah.
I mean, William Rolfe was no dummy. Find an
That's
addictive
true.
substance, give it to people.
Sounds like something we may have seen today. I don't know, opium.
Oh, opium for the Chinese.
Gosh, those things are still around today, and it's just making even more profit for those warlords, I guess you could
Well,
say.
I mean, yeah, Afghanistan is their cash crop.
Right.
But we see, but tobacco farming is very labor intensive.
Oh, for sure.
Harvest season it's an all hands on deck, and then go find some more hands.
Yeah.
So again, and it's very lucrative.
Mm-hmm.
So you're able to afford slaves and have them full time. I mean, nobody's going to have a hired person for full time.
No.
Because they're not going to be doing direct important work all the time, and
Mhm.
so you're not going to hire people, white people.
And
Well, or anybody that gets a full wage,
right.
which they didn't have minimum wage laws, but there's always been a minimum wage. At a certain point, people won't take your job.
Right.
They won't take the opportunity that you're offering them to work for no money. Which actually comes to modern times really well. We see that right now. People not wanting to work for a job that can't pay their bills, so they go into the giant reset or the great reset that we're
Mhm.
having now. And with the slave economy, it makes it even harder to kind of figure out, because there's not a lot else to do. Again, everything's agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have a skill, blacksmith, glass blower, leather worker, something that allows you to work in a city and make money directly, you become a laborer or a small farmer. And that's a very difficult, again, that'll come up later.
Yeah.
When we talk about that stress in the South.
Right.
We don't have that stress in the North because everybody kind of sees things more homogeneously. A farmer in New England doesn't want to be a person who lives in the town, and a person in the town doesn't want to be a farmer.
No, of course not.
And they don't really have a skill set that crosses over.
Right.
So they're not in competition with one another.
Right. And, and in fact, they're almost like they're that. I scratch your back, you scratch mine.
Very much
Where
so.
again, your farmer is the one that's going to be making growing the grain, growing the corn, growing all of those crops, bringing them to market. What is your business owner going to do? Your business owner is going to trade those things for him, or he's going to buy it from him, or whatever the case is, make some type of whiskey or something that's going to give them a lucrative piece of that crop. So it's a symbiotic relationship in a way, where your farmer is helping the business owner's helping the farmer.
Yes.
And
You don't have that you still have that in the South,
right.
but it's distorted because you have this additional group of
Yes.
slaves that distort the labor market in a huge fashion.
Well, and again, what happens? Again, it's if you have such a huge, if you have all your eggs in a basket for tobacco, and say something like a boll weevil comes and destroys your crop, you're screwed for that season.
Yes.
And it could destroy your whole livelihood.
Mhm.
Whereas a farmer in New England, he's not really focused on so much, so it's not going to hurt him as much, if that helps.
Well, it won't hurt the economy of scale for sure.
Right.
Number of people won't be affected, and of course, a small family farm doesn't have a profit margin.
Right.
Which, unfortunately, is the case of all of history. Those who have a large amount of excess money
Mm-hmm.
change how the rules are made.
Mm-hmm.
A small New England farmer, despite the development of American democracy in that setting, isn't going to change policy of the crown.
Right.
Whereas a William Penn or a Lord Calvert,
Right.
has the money to get a colony.
Right.
Everybody else just kind of has to live there. But we have this difference. There's slavery in North and South before
Yes.
the Revolution.
And that's
It's very different looking.
right.
Because in the North, most slaves would be in the cities,
Yeah, working
working
in
with
something.
these wealthy
Mhm.
individuals who have extra money. They sell rum or slaves or guns
Mhm.
or whatever. They're as they start manufacturing.
Right.
I don't know if factory would be the best word to
Yeah,
use.
good point.
Because we don't really see factories developing until the 1800s.
Right. Most of them are going to be like your homespun little operations.
Right, but if you can turn out 20 muskets in a month, that's
Right.
a factory.
That
I
is
mean, as
true.
far as the time frame is concerned.
Sure.
You know, we get to 1860, somebody does
Ooh.
20 rifles a month, it's hardly worth talking to them.
Yes. You're like, come on, what are you doing? You like growing all of your own timber and
Yeah.
using it anyway.
Yeah.
The idea is, again, when you're looking at it in terms of the northern slavery, you're also learning a trade as a slave in a way, especially because you're going to be working with a wealthy individual who
Yeah.
has
And
small numbers.
you're more likely to be lettered.
Yes.
Or literate for today's
Right.
stuff. But
Right.
I mean, you're more likely to learn to read and write because it's such an important facet of what they do in the North.
Yes.
Going to market with a list of things to get saves the blacksmith or the gun maker or the whiskey maker time that
Right.
he doesn't have to spend. He can send his slave there and take care of it.
And if your slave cannot read and say, okay, I need, five cans of polish or whatever the case is, you're wasting your time.
And kind of as a secondary, we see living conditions for slaves in the North, because while they don't get a direct benefit, they're not getting a bonus at Christmas
No.
or things like, well, I guess they might get a bonus at
Well-
Christmas, they might get better food.
Right.
But because they typically are household,
Mm-hmm.
if the household improves and gets a better house, they get better quarters.
Right.
Whereas in the South, most blacks are in rural areas,
Yes.
and nothing matters really what happens on the plantation. If it's a bumper crop this year for their plantation, everybody else's gets eaten by boll weevil, so cotton is now worth $1 bazillion a bushel, they're not going to see any benefit.
Well, and that's the thing again with your southern plantation style slavery. And I mean, I've heard many of documentaries, and of course Ken Burns has wonderful documentaries talking about the Civil War and the lead up to the Civil War and the slavery in the South. And one of the key points that he talks about is the fact that a slave would be born in a dirt floor shack that is probably no bigger
That you
than-
could see through.
Yes.
I mean, you could look out the wall.
Yes, and if they were able to make it to the age of 6, they would be in the fields as soon as possible.
Yeah, and even if it were in the fields, they would have some agricultural duty,
Right.
caring for the livestock, whatever they were doing. They were doing something to benefit the plantation in a direct manner. Now, that isn't really any different than the northern farms. With
No.
a large family, the children would be working very quickly because farming, up until modern times, was a survival-based situation. There was no room for a teenager to be sitting in their room doing nothing.
Yeah,
um,
it's
or trying to get into driving the buggy all over the place. That
It's
just
either-
wasn't. Everybody worked.
right. It's you work or you
Go
don't
hungry.
eat.
Yeah.
And in the South, it is a little bit like that, especially for your smaller farmers.
Yes.
Because again, not
Yeah.
everybody in the South owns slaves.
Yeah. What? 10% maybe.
If you're lucky,
10 to
10%, 10 to
15%,
15.
depending on the state, of
And
course.
we're talking like the top of the top were able to achieve the status of being a slave owner. Most of your Southerners didn't even know of a slave. And in fact, sometimes your Southern whites were having to almost rent themselves out as being hired helps, hired hands.
Again, just like in the North, it's a good way to make quick money.
Right.
In harvest time, it's hard work, but at least you get
You
paid.
do what you gotta do.
And through harvest.
Mm-hmm.
And harvest, of course, is a weeks-long process trying
Right.
to get those crops in.
especially without the mechanisms that we have today.
And this is also where we see that switch. When we talk about the establishment of those colonies in the early 1600s, it's by the mid to late 1600s that the codes have all been rewritten.
Yes.
The end of the indentured servant is already here and gone.
Mm-hmm.
And now, if you're black, you're a slave.
Right.
With some exceptions, but those exceptions either move north very
Mhm.
rapidly,
Yes.
or they die off.
Right. And again, one particular instance is a man by the name of Anthony Johnson, who he was able to pretty much buy himself out of indentured servitude. Got himself a nice plot of land. I think it started at about 40 acres, which is
Good plot.
in the 1650s, that's a good amount of land in Virginia, especially when you have a large amount of white individuals with you.
Yes.
Well, unfortunately, after about 2 or 3 generations, the he called it a plantation, but it really was just a major farm. It started to grow to about over 100 acres, but by about that 3rd generation, it was gone. And again, you're looking about 1670, 1680, where they start to switch into that idea of blacks are no longer landowners.
Right. They're no longer just other. They're now other and lesser.
Right.
Which is contrary to what we would assume from psychology, where you get to know people and you think more of them. It's like
Mhm.
it's like almost the exact opposite,
Mm-hmm.
where you now see them all as lesser.
Right.
So we see that really big switch. We go from slavery being, I would never call it a good institution, an economic necessity to build a lot of the things that we think of as civilization, yes,
Mhm.
but practiced in a way that, while not humane, at least was limited
Right.
to a single person through through their lifetime and not beyond, not their children, not their wives, things like that, to a permanently indentured race,
Yes.
which is we go from that, like I said, a necessary evil maybe to really, to, in my opinion, just an evil institution. It seeks to really, it's all about greed.
Well, and
Slaves are seen as a way of making more money.
and it's
or
destroying,
show status.
It's destroying a whole civilization, if you will, at this time. Now,
Oh,
now you know, people today in 2022 are arguing, oh, you know, my ancestor was a slave. Well, yes,
Mhm.
I'm sorry about that.
Mhm.
But again, that was something that we can't go back and turn around.
Mhm.
As much as we wish we could, we can't. And it really does make it for a problem, especially as we talk again, this idea of an evil institution.
Yes, it is. No matter how you dress up, and you can find examples of masters who were good,
Right.
who treated their slaves well, they respected slave marriages, but at the end of the day, they used slaves for their personal economic benefit and no other reason.
Yeah.
There was, I guess, the rare, and in some states illegal, teaching of blacks to read and write.
Mostly in your deep south.
Yeah, the deep south. And of course, as we spread west and we get Alabama and Mississippi,
Mhm.
and then
Mhm.
Florida gets added in,
Mhm.
and Louisiana, and Tennessee, and Kentucky's a slave state as well. And that's kind of your thing with the ordinances, but that's after we become the United States.
Right.
But before the Revolution in 1776, slavery existed everywhere.
Yeah.
It was in every colony.
Right.
Although here in this cool article by J. Gordon Hilton, apparently not in Vermont. Now technically Vermont wasn't a colony, a separate
No.
colony it was part of New York,
Right. Right.
but evidently there weren't slaves in Vermont, which is kind of an interesting thing. But then again, Vermont is hillbilly country. I mean, there's nobody out there, because we're not even talking really farmers at this point. We're talking loggers
Right.
and hunters and
Mhm.
trappers. We're not talking a lot of farmsteads.
The geography of Vermont is what? Great for skiing.
Great for skiing and making maple syrup.
Yep. That's like the two things. It's like Maryland, crab cakes and football.
Yeah,
That's what they do.
That's pretty much it, yeah. Yes, but as the revolution occurs, and then of course we have that weirdness with blacks being offered their freedom.
Oh my gosh.
To fight for both sides.
Yes.
In different areas. Not in the South for the revolution. For the American side, it was mostly in the North.
Yes.
In the South, the Crown was offering freedom.
Right. Lord Dunmore, who was a prolific, landed gentry of British Crown, he offered during the beginning, actually, of the actual fighting. Of course, fighting takes place 1775. April 75 is when it starts. And the declaration isn't until July of 76. So theoretically, we were fighting this war for almost a year and 3 months. Is that about right? A year and about 3-4 months before we actually declared independence. Which again, Lord Dunmore is one that is seeing. He's really reading between the lines. He's thinking, okay, well, if I can get some of these loyalists to say, hey, we'll reimburse you, slaves, for you to help us. And he ultimately, what he says to all blacks in the South, if you leave your masters and come fight with us, which, yeah, many of the masters in South Carolina and in Georgia and in parts of the South are going to say, no, but ultimately they do have a little bit of understanding.
I'm sure that caused some tension because in the South they were much more Tory or
Yes,
loyalist
yes,
in their
yes.
sentiment than they in the New England and the Mid-Atlantic
Oh,
colonies
my
were
gosh.
much more against the Crown because they were much more urbanly developed.
Well,
And they had those population densities
yes.
where they were looking at the concept that they should have members of Parliament. They should be sending people to London to represent them, and the Crown was like, no, you're a colony,
Right.
which is not taxation, but taxation without representation is kind of that thing that sets it off. It isn't so much the taxes that the Crown put in as the fact that the colonialists had no say in the taxes. And of course the limitations like you talked about, going west of the Appalachians
Right.
was forbidden by the Crown.
Right, and especially here with that proclamation line of 1763.
Yes.
And now, of course, this year is after the French and Indian War, which is kind of another thing that we'll talk about when we get to the development of the colonies and kind of explaining the differences between those and how they develop and kind of the bringing up upon those. But the idea again is it's almost as if you have your how can I put this? You have your major educated elite in your northern section of the colonies, i.e. New York, New Jersey,
Boston,
of course, yeah. That's where most of the fighting takes place.
Harvard is, earliest university in America.
Right, and it was established in the 1600s.
Yeah, way earlier than we're talking about for most of this.
Yeah. And think about it in the South. How many major universities do you have prior to the Revolution? Really, the only one that I can think of is William and Mary. And
yeah, that's really all I can
that
think of.
might be the only one that I can think of that's a major
Unless there's one in
institution.
Charleston, but I don't remember.
I couldn't remember exactly either,
So-
but again,
it's a thin layer.
Right.
And which of course
Right.
that's where that Lord Dunmore would look. He would look at South Carolina, which
Yes.
at the time was 60% black,
if not more.
and he needs troops. Going after the white landowners isn't going to get you a whole lot. They all want to be officers.
Right. So if you can get a
regiment or two.
right, of blacks ex-slaves who are saying, hey, you give me my freedom and I'll fight for you all day or all night. I don't
Yes.
care.
Yes.
So-
So I have something to gain.
Right, and that's the thing is Washington was so reluctant to do this.
Mhm.
But think about Washington. Where is he coming from?
Virginia,
And what does he have?
slaves.
And why would he not want to give them up? Because he understands that
Well, Mostly because they're his wives.
Right. Yes, you're right. You're right. Washington came into this idea of slavery or slave owning because, well, of course, he was kind of he was a poor guy.
He was, I mean,
I
for
wouldn't
the
say
time, he was
poor.
probably middle class.
Yes, but he wasn't. He definitely wasn't anything like what his wife
no.
Martha was.
No, she was definitely well heeled.
Mm-hmm.
But you can understand, given his background,
Right.
because even if he was poor or middle class, his aspirations were the same as Jefferson's,
Yeah.
Madison's,
Mhm.
Monroe's. These Virginians who have grown up with large plantations being the norm. Really, the only thing Washington did that was way ahead of his time is he was diversified. He didn't just grow tobacco.
Right.
His crop, he had dozens of different things growing on his plantations, I guess, for lack of a better term.
And you were lucky enough last year to go to Mount Vernon.
Yes, an
and
amazing visit.
see kind of how his home outside of outside of New York, because he was president in New York in the first two terms.
Philadelphia for a good chunk of that too.
So, but you saw how he lived. You saw
Yes.
how it was, and again, you kind of have this change again, how these founding fathers really saw the institution of slavery.
And the gap, that's probably one of the things I don't think that the tour guides really showed. I mean, they talked about the gap that, Washington and Martha, they shared this bedroom and it was theirs.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at what the doctor that he brought, who had a 10 by 12 room, that's a profession. I mean, a doctor is not, we're not talking about you brought in a nerf herder, you brought in a doctor.
Right.
And he doesn't got that much. So when you look at the slave quarters, it's shared, but it's still divvied up into rooms. The gap between slave and owner as far as their living conditions isn't what we would see today.
Right.
When we see the difference between someone living in a ghetto in Detroit and, the president of Ford Motor.
Right.
The difference there is, thousands and thousands of square feet, and, the gap has widened as far as living conditions, because living conditions have changed.
Sure.
Back then, if you got an appendicitis, well, hope you live through it, because we don't know how to take it out, and if we do, we're probably going to kill you anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very interesting learning experience to see the fact that, all things said and done, yes, he was a wealthy man, but he didn't have air conditioning.
No.
So nobody had that.
No.
You hope for a breeze off the river.
Yes.
His advantage was that he didn't have to do all the manual labor.
That's true.
So he could afford to be gone for, 7, almost 8 years with one visit to Mount Vernon.
Jeez.
He took his duty very seriously. So Washington, but again, Washington's going to be reluctant because getting back on course here, his aspirations, his understanding of the way life should work, at least in Virginia, which is, of course, he's a Virginian.
Yes.
Not an American
Not
yet.
an American yet. No, we don't think of this concept until almost after the Civil War.
Well, I mean, there's the concept of an American, but it'd be the same concept as a European.
Right.
Nobody sees a contradiction in being a French person and a European.
Right.
They just don't really, those two things don't
mesh.
collide.
Right.
American and Virginian until after the Civil War, same idea.
Right.
Same idea. I'm an American, but what's that mean?
Right.
I'm a Virginian first
Right.
and foremost, or I'm
a New Yorker or
whatever,
a Massachusetts.
Yeah. I don't know.
Massachusetts.
But so he's reluctant to do that. But the revolution comes and goes.
Right.
Probably the most important thing that comes out of the revolution for blacks is the Declaration of Independence.
Of course.
Not because it affects the life of the people living there, but it sets a ideal, and
Yes.
that's a word that doesn't get used much today. An ideal, not a perfection that we already have attained, but something that we will strive towards, that all men are created equal. And I don't know that Thomas Jefferson probably even thought that way because he's a Virginian,
Yeah, of course.
and,
Yes.
and
Slaves
blacks
in
are
the-
other
Yes.
and lesser. So I don't know if he considered them in when he was writing that famous line. But it inspires Frederick Douglass in a major way
Huge.
that this is a goal that America as a country can reach a new thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it would be hard to understate that. And really, the American Revolution is the height of the Enlightenment.
It is.
The concept that, well, it's the best of the Enlightenment revolutions, because the French Revolution goes so off the rails.
Well, and ultimately, and the thing that you kind of keep in mind as well, when it comes to revolutions, when we think of it in terms of a math term, a revolution is what?
One turn around a wheel.
Yeah, so 360 degrees, correct?
Yes.
In political terms, however, a revolution is supposed to be 180
Yeah, well,
degrees.
yes. Well, at least 90.
At least something that is different than the norm. So when we think of like the French Revolution, you mentioned that
was 360.
That was a 360 degree complete. You go from having a king back to having an emperor, which is ultimately the king as well, because well, Napoleon and
But it's actually stronger than the king.
Yes,
which
because
is kind of weird. But again, that's what they
So-
messed up.
right.
Whereas the American Revolution was to put it in Marxist terms, a bourgeois revolution. It was the middle class
right.
wanting to establish not necessarily anything really different economically.
No, because well, we kept it going the way we were.
It was purely a political revolution. It was, we are going to govern ourselves because you refuse to let us be part of your government. Really,
Right. And
basically, if you won't let us play, we're going to take our ball and go home. I don't want to make light of our founding fathers, but it really was if you're not going to let us into your system where we can thrive and have ownership of being British subjects,
right.
then we'd rather be our own because we know how we live.
Mhm.
You've already put these taxes on us that are onerous because of the way we live compared to the way you live.
Mm-hmm.
And we see these limitations on where our settlers can go, and what are we going to do when we start running out of room when we have an entire continent to look at? We don't even know how far it goes yet because we
Right.
haven't done Lewis and Clark.
Right.
But again, the big thing for slavery is that I think that thing, but it's also that Enlightenment idea, and it takes hold after the Revolution. The number of states that start banning
Oh my
slavery.
gosh, I know, right?
And it's like it's one of those things that modern people looking back don't want. They see slavery, and that's all they see. They see the black mark.
Right.
They don't see the fact that, like we've talked about, slavery has been around forever.
Right.
And yes, you can't deny that in America, well, in the Americas,
Mm-hmm.
it took a really nasty racial turn and became truly evil as far as I'm concerned. But at the core of that is, this is also that nation at its very beginning started looking to a future that didn't have it. We haven't hit the Industrial Revolution yet.
No.
That's not even a thing.
No.
So there isn't machines to take the part of these people. We are literally looking at a group of people, especially in the northern colonies, starting with Pennsylvania.
Right.
Again, Willie Penn and his
cronies,
descendants.
right.
His descendants were really, I guess, with lack of a better, very forward-thinking politically. Even though I don't think it was from their religious beliefs, but it looked to a future when all men truly were equal.
In a way, they were more of in putting it into 20th or 21st century, well, 20th century really, they were progressives.
Yeah,
Free thinking.
because they saw Native Americans and blacks as people.
Right. Not this person to do work for me, but a person in general.
Who I might trade with, who might work for me, but
Yes.
they work for me as in the sense that I hire a carpenter
Yes.
to fix my fence.
Not because I'm going to capture them or I'm going to buy them for the rest of their life and then their descendants'
If they
lives.
choose not to work for me, that's their choice. It's not.
We have a free thinking here.
Yes, and so we have this huge movement, which, and again, we're not talking about a system. The American system is not designed to move swiftly. In fact, it is designed to the exact opposite.
Right.
It is designed to slow everything down, especially on the federal level.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to see this sweeping by 1807, despite the fact we put it in our Constitution. By 1807, no more importation of slaves. But that doesn't do anything to end slavery.
No.
Because America doesn't have slavery like the Caribbean.
No.
A Caribbean island would die without the importation of slaves because their death rate was so high.
Yes.
In the Americas, this isn't the problem. We imported, what, 500,000 slaves in the total.
Yeah,
completely?
right around there. Yes.
But by the time the Civil War breaks out, we have what, 2 million?
Actually, about 4.
4, so
4
double
million.
that. So I was
Yeah.
a little off.
So, and again, most of those people are in the South. You
Yes,
got to keep
by
that in
vast
mind.
majority, vast majority.
But because again, we're going to get to that article here in just a second. Most of those northern colonies, beginning, and then eventually states, are going to ban slavery.
Right.
And yes, we mention it because of when the Constitution was written in 1787 and ratified, what, 1790, 1789, 1790,
Well, I mean-
I believe it was, officially ratified, I think.
Well, it was officially ratified in 1787.
Is that,
Well,
well, I
because-
mean, by the rest of the states.
Because Washington becomes president in 1789.
Okay,
So
Right.
that was with the new Constitution. So
Right.
So 1788 is our first election. But I mean,
but by then, you've already got, what, you've got Pennsylvania, who's already starting to say, we
here
want
we go.
to,
Massachusetts
uh-huh,
by completely abolished. Pennsylvania did it where
Gradually.
It was any slave that was born was free after 1780,
Mhm.
and it basically was going to be grandfathered out.
right.
So if you were born, unfortunately, in December of 1779, sorry.
Sorry about it, but
You're
that's
a
just
slave
how
for
it
life.
goes.
But again, it's that concept that they are looking to a future where it doesn't exist.
Right,
It doesn't exist at all, and that is when we ignore that as part of our American heritage, we're missing a huge part of the story.
sure.
That these Enlightenment ideals, this idea of all men are created equal, really does actually spill over into people's politics and their lives. Because they pass these ordinances, they pass these
Yes.
laws to get rid of the institution of slavery, but only in the North.
And that's the thing. And you know, Thomas Jefferson has a wonderful quote when he's writing this Declaration of Independence. And of course, you know, he is able to survive into the 1820s. So he sees the Constitution. He sees the development of these western areas here. Well, I take that back. The old northwestern areas. But the idea again is of him knowing this institution of slavery. And his quote is, slavery is like holding a wolf back by the ears. You don't dare let it go
Yes.
for the fact that it might come back to kill you.
Yes. Yeah.
But you don't hold it so tight that it will smother itself.
Why? Because then you don't get anything out of it.
Exactly.
And,
him being a southern slave owner.
well, yeah, he would understand it very clearly.
Mhm.
It's very hard. In the North, I won't say it's easy, because
No.
it involves getting rid of social and, I won't say racial, because I'm not sure those were as developed as they are in the South.
Not as often.
But
No.
you have a lot of these ideas that people are jettisoning in
Right.
favor of this ideal of all men are created equal, that everyone should have an opportunity to succeed or fail.
Right.
That's always the little addendum that people like to forget.
Right.
If you have the opportunity to succeed, you also have the opportunity to fail. Otherwise, it's meaningless. Because-
And so ultimately what we find is we start to find, again, even though there's the emancipation of these slaves and gradual emancipation, I should mention,
Yeah.
you're going to still find that social hierarchy all throughout. It's not as prevalent in the North because, again, you're still going to see some of that racial tension.
Yes.
It's inevitable.
It's- well,
It's inevitable.
And again, that's other.
Right.
Because that same racial tension exists when the Irish arrive.
Mm-hmm.
Same racial tension exists when Germans arrive in great
Right,
number.
right.
So it's not a color of your skin racial. It's
No.
other.
It's because
It's you're not
di-
like me.
It's you're different than my belief.
Right, or worse yet, you run around with a bunch of red hair.
Yes.
Crazy people.
I feel like he's saying something about me.
I mean, because people so often look for difference
Yeah, of course.
as a reason to be separate, and it's obviously not healthy. But one of the first things the new Congress does is pass the Northwest Ordinance,
Right.
which bans slavery in all those territories north of the Ohio River.
Exactly.
So all the way out technically till Minnesota and Iowa, right?
Yes.
Are they-
well, I should
Are they
say
covered that far, or is it just going
that
to
it's just so what you find here is in that unfortunately when we talk about that Northwest Ordinance, we're talking about this here, this area here,
Right.
in the circled area. So you've got Illinois, you've got Indiana, Ohio, what eventually is Michigan, Wisconsin. Okay, those 5 areas are what the Northwest Ordinance and the Northwest Territory eventually become.
Right.
And like we mentioned earlier, the one of the main clauses in that is that it is no longer permitting slavery,
Right. Slavery is abolished in those territories,
which
which means all those new states that come in the 1810s and 20s are all free states in every sense of the word.
yeah, and so we find now that that term of free versus slave.
Yes.
The 18 teens, the 1820s, that's when you're first starting to find that difference between the two major groups.
Well, an expressed difference.
Right.
I mean, obviously the differences were there.
Yes.
In the way people lived and
Of course.
things like that. But they start expressing the fact that I live in a free state
Right.
as opposed to a slave state.
Right.
And which of course makes those border states, Maryland and Delaware in the east, and then Kentucky as it's added,
Right.
which is really shortly after the Constitution,
Right.
1791, I think.
Mhm.
But it's always a pairing.
Yes, that's the thing. You've got to keep in mind when it comes to early American politics, they wanted to have that balance. Not so much in the House, because of course the House is dealing with population percentage, not equal
Right.
representation.
Even with the 3/5 clause of the Constitution,
Yeah.
the South is losing that battle.
Right.
Because during the 1800s, the South is getting a trickle of immigrants coming in to Charleston and Richmond and those areas. In the North, it's like a fire hose.
Right. Yes.
Especially once the Irish potato famine.
Oh my
began.
gosh, the
Over a
1840s.
million Irishmen in this,
mhm.
which doesn't sound like a lot today when we have a population of 300 some million. But back then, when our population is 10 million,
Right.
a million people is huge.
And then most of them coming into Boston or New York or, that's really most of the only 2 places they end up going.
Philadelphia.
Right,
That's
right,
where
right.
my family came.
Right, forgot, yes, you're right. So those 3 major port cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, you don't really see them going into Maine.
Well, but you do see them
Express,
into New Jersey.
Sure.
Into the areas around that, but generally speaking, yes, they cluster.
Right.
Like most immigrants. Even today, most immigrants cluster in a particular spot. You see
Until-
that even with Somalis.
Mhm.
They go to a certain city, and then they, of course, when they bring family over, that's where they go. And
Right.
it's a protective mechanism.
And-
I mean, you want to be around people that know who you are.
Interesting thing, a little side note here. Interesting thing, most Somali immigrants, they come here to the Kansas City area.
Mhm.
Either Kansas City or Toronto, of all 2 places. I don't know why you would want to go up to the Great White North of Canada.
From Somalia,
Right.
on the equator.
Right. Or even Kansas City of all places.
Well, really,
But
but at least we have summers that would be
Right,
recognizable.
yes,
But
yes,
oh,
but-
dear Lord, Toronto.
Mhm. Yes, quite an interesting little snippet. But getting back to it, again, when we look at some of these Northwest ordinances, the Northwest Territories, the development of now the pairings of these areas. Again, what was the one that came in with Kentucky? Do you remember?
Vermont.
Vermont came in
They
with
were both
Kentucky.
right away.
Right, and then you have here like Tennessee, one of those other major
Comes in
western.
with, I think, Ohio.
I believe so, yes. And then you've got Alabama, I think, with Indiana.
I don't know if they
It's-
were paired exactly like that
But
on
it's-
purpose, but it was within a couple years.
Right.
That they didn't ever allow. They didn't ever allow a large disparity.
No.
Of more than 4 states, because after Rhode Island joined, they were the last ones to join.
Mm-hmm.
It was 2 extra senators were free state versus 2 extra senators. Now, on almost every other issue, those numbers didn't matter.
No.
It was more about political party. But when we started
Right.
talking about slavery issues,
Mhm.
it was.
Yes.
There were Northern Democrats and there were Southern Democrats. And of
And-
course, the Republicans don't exist yet.
Nope. we have what? We have Whigs,
Federalist
we have Federalist
Republicans.
Republicans, Jeffersonian Democrats. We have all different kinds of political parties, and then
Mhm.
by Jackson in the 1820s, we do finally have that Democrat versus whoever really on the other side because
Yeah.
they're so discombobulated. But one thing that we find here that is most important by 1820, 1821 is now the establishment of how this Missouri Compromise is coming about.
Yes. You know, I learned it was the Maine Missouri Compromise, but everything I read now just says the Missouri Compromise. But it's literally the two states come into the Union at this almost the exact same time. What, 6 months apart or something like that?
Yes, because Maine comes in 1820, as you'll see, breaking off of Massachusetts and becoming their own state here in 1820. Missouri not admitted until, I cannot remember the exact month, but I think
it's like 1821.
Yeah, right. Like you said, within about 6
Probably
months.
this summer.
Right.
I mean, that's typically when they
More
do
than
a
likely.
lot of their business.
Mhm.
Because, you know, you got your crops planted,
Mhm.
you can go do business and then get
Go-
them back
go
home
forward.
before harvest.
Right, because I mean, again, this is before even your country or your county roads, where you have, you know, your county
Yeah,
highway system.
Yeah, you might have roads that led between major cities.
Right.
But they weren't very well maintained,
No.
except in certain areas,
Mhm.
maybe a county
Mhm.
would grade it.
Right,
But it's still dirt.
right, and you're using horse and buggy.
So your states can't be too large, like we see out west. We see in the western territories. We start
Oh
seeing
my
the
gosh.
train
Right.
expands the area that you can have a state. Whereas back east, everything's smaller because you have to be able to ride your horse to
Exactly.
the state capital to
Exactly.
represent your people.
And again, like the idea of, you know, for instance, Tennessee for that matter. It's such it may be long, but it's a very skinny state.
And it has good rivers.
Right.
Good rivers that you can use, the
Right.
Cumberland and the
Mhm.
Tennessee
Mhm.
and of course Mississippi on one side.
Right.
It allows you to get places a little bit quicker.
Mhm.
Steamboat, well, that's 1820s.
1820s.
1820s, 30s,
Yep.
steamboats start showing up, which of course makes the Northwest an explosion of
Oh
wealth
my goodness.
because of suddenly they have access. They can get their stuff up to the Great Lakes through
Mhm.
canal system
Mhm.
and then over to the Erie Canal that runs from the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Hudson River down
Right.
to New York, which
Right.
of course is where we see Philadelphia supplanted as the major city in New York starts to take over because, well, the technology just passed it by.
Yep.
You know, you couldn't dig a canal across the Alleghenies.
Oh, I would not even want to try.
To get it to the Potomac, which see would have gone to the Potomac anyway, so it wouldn't
Right.
even still wouldn't have gone to Philadelphia.
Right.
But that's just a, you know, I've been to Philadelphia a lot, so I know some of those cool stories. But as we get into the later part of this, we haven't really had a lot of Supreme Court cases. It's really the Senate is the fight.
Yes.
We have this back and forth in the Senate where with admissions. At a certain point, with Texas being added and
Okay.
Florida,
Right.
the southern states actually, the slave states actually have an advantage for a bit, and then Wisconsin and Iowa join.
And so, by what you find here, again, when we talk about the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri-Maine Compromise, Missouri Compromise, whichever you'd like to say, the thing you have to keep in mind is this. And it's an interesting little thing, but anything that is south of this line will be slave. And anything north, excluding Missouri, because, well, of course, they're an exception. Because
Oh,
they
to
want to
everything.
they want to be slave, but anything north of that southern border would be free.
Right. But I mean, all your border states are technically north of that line.
Right.
I mean, Missouri, Kentucky,
Mhm.
Maine,
Mhm.
Maryland, and Delaware, they're all well north of that line.
Right.
Technically, with that line, Virginia would be a free state, but already established as a slave state.
Exactly. And so the thing that you keep in mind, Ian, of course, is when Texas is established in 1846.
640. Yep.
Yeah.
45. Technically.
45, all right.
Well, no,
So-
that's when it was annexed. It was made a state
Right.
in 1846.
Right, so in 1846, when Texas technically becomes that state,
Mhm.
it has to lob off, and actually it had quite a bit of territory up here into this unorganized territory. It had to lob it off because, of course, it was under it was under the Missouri Compromise, and anything above that line.
That would have been a cool map to have with that silly, goofy stovepipe thing
I
sticking
know,
out.
right? It was just something else. But really, the thing that we find here is by 1850,
Well,
things
yeah,
start to get
because
shaky.
Minnesota gets put in
Mhm.
1858.
Mm-hmm.
Kansas is looking at admission.
Mm-hmm.
California's been admitted in 1850.
Right.
What's Oregon gets put in 1859.
Right.
So all of a sudden, this balance of power is shifting dramatically. We're starting talking about filibuster-proof majorities for the South, for the North, for
Mhm.
those free states. My little article here, that article I referenced earlier, Minnesota's even admission to statehood was opposed by most of the Southern senators because of that balance of power thing
my.
sliding away. But why is it sliding away? It's not just sliding away because of territory, because
No.
there's plenty of territory. They've added all this with the Mexican War.
Right.
They added a ton of new slave territory. Really, other than Northern California, everything that they added in the Mexican War would have been slave territory.
Yep.
But you have this, what was my train of thought just derailed. But you don't have immigration.
No.
And as bad as everybody likes to talk, badmouth the 3/5 compromise, it was a compromise. Without the 3/5 compromise, there is no United States.
No.
Just period.
It's
I don't care what your political persuasion is. That's just fact.
It is.
Without that compromise, the slave states will not join the Union, and you'll have two countries sitting on side next to each other, probably fighting over Kentucky and Missouri, all the way across the continent. People would be fighting.
We would have never fought the Civil War in the 1860s. We would have not even gone there.
Well, we would have fought more wars
Right.
over a longer period of time,
Right.
trying to keep territories inside one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the only thing you would have seen out of that result is slavery in the North would have been banned sooner,
Yes.
because it would have become such a political imperative.
Right.
But that's an alternate universe that doesn't have a 3/5 compromise.
Exactly.
With the 3/5 compromise, it's not saying, well, I mean, it is not saying by itself that blacks are only 3/5 as valuable as whites. That's not what the compromise is about,
No,
especially
it's-
for Northerners. It's refusing to
right.
allow slave owners to get more votes
Mhm.
because they own people.
Right.
And so they're knocking down the value, and that's where they had to stop.
Mm-hmm.
Why it wasn't half, I don't know. I guess because of the votes.
It's all about population,
the votes.
population size, and then when it comes into the House of Representatives.
And it was during this time, though, we see in the House that population-based stuff.
Right.
The South just slides the
Mhm.
entire time from
Mhm.
1787 to 1860. They
And
go
we
from
just-
like 42% of the population of the
Mhm.
House to less than 30-some%.
Yeah.
And continuing to slide because, again, the fire hose
Right.
of immigration from Europe just pouring in. There's a reason the Statue of Liberty is in New York, not Charleston.
Right. Where again, you may see a trickling of people coming in from Scotland.
A lot of Scottish went to Georgia for some reason, which I can't imagine. That's almost like Somalia to Toronto.
Why would they
just
want to
in
do
reverse.
that? I mean, but again, when you got to think about it, by the 1840s, where's your industry? It's in the North.
Oh, yeah, by this time the Industrial Revolution is really starting to get kicked up along the rivers of the North.
Yes.
With the textile factories
Right.
in Lowell, Massachusetts, and New Jersey and New York. And they need labor.
And there's the thing, when we talked about it before, Irish ultimately helped to build the Erie Canal, which will open up that vast
trade in the Northwest Territories.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Irishmen died every mile for the railroads, so that's
Yes.
1840s.
Yep.
Um,
And then even into the 1850s and 60s.
cheap labor, and honestly speaking, it's another what if. What if these northern states don't outlaw slavery before this industrial revolution starts? Because they used the Irish very much like slaves.
They did.
I mean, they used them up
And
in
ultimately killed
factory
them
towns.
as
It
much as they
killed,
could.
It killed them
Yep.
rapidly on the railroads and
Right.
in these factory towns. But if slavery wouldn't have been fully banned, because they couldn't really go back on that, especially
No.
like we talked about, the slavery issue has poisoned the politics
Yes.
in both directions.
Yes.
New Jersey, even though they're the last ones of the northern states to ban it, still wouldn't be going back to a full slave state
No.
because of industrial revolution. They will just take what they have, which is cheap labor.
Yes.
I mean, to be honest,
Wherever it's coming from.
hiring an Irishman is much cheaper than hiring a slave because you don't have to feed him.
Exactly.
You know, it's as rude as it can be, but it's the truth.
It's true.
You don't have any
Right.
responsibilities as a factory owner
Yeah,
to keep that person in a certain lifestyle.
Right, you're losing money because you're paying them, but it doesn't mean that you're having to give more
Right.
than what they're worth.
They have to worry about what they get, whether they can afford an apartment
Yes.
on their salary.
Yes.
Not your problem.
Right.
Um,
And so, but
so again, we haven't seen any change in the mentality of other.
no.
It's just shifted to a new group in the north.
Yep.
And then another reason, of course, this is the time to talk about that. As we move into the south, you do have those settlers.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is there's no place for those to go. Because in the south, you just buy a slave.
Yes.
It's cheap. You can get a bunch more of them down the road
Mhm.
at a plantation. Somebody's always looking to get rid of the excess because
Right.
they don't need that many more.
Right.
And they keep having babies because you don't give them cable television.
And again, that's why you have more than 4 million black
even though you only
slaves.
imported 500,000.
Yes, because, well, what happens when you have nothing else better to do? And
I'm sure a Caribbean slave, what they call those? Foremen?
uh-huh.
I bet some of those Caribbean slave foremen probably thought Southern slave owners were too soft
Oh, for sure.
because their death rate wasn't high enough.
of course, you've got to pump those numbers up.
Well, obviously you're treating them too nice. They're having too many babies.
Yes.
They're not tired enough from working in the fields.
No.
All sorts of excuses.
Of course.
Horrible human beings, but whatever.
Yes, you're right.
But now you have this tension in the South. North Carolina being a good example.
Mhm.
West Virginia being an excellent example.
Yes, they actually secede from a state.
Yes, because they want to live as free Americans. They're white.
Yeah.
They come over, they live in the South, but they live as, like my wife's family, poor dirt farmers.
Right.
They live on small plots of land, on not very agriculturally viable land in North Carolina. It's
Oh my
mountainous.
gosh.
It's, it's hard to make it a living and you're not gonna get rich.
Yeah, it's the same in West Virginia where you have more coal miners than you do millionaires.
And as is the nature of any economic situation like that, white Southerners
Uh-huh.
who are in that circumstance, which is probably over half,
Yes.
because plantation owners are not that many.
No.
So most whites either live in cities or they're poor
Yeah.
and they live in the country.
Right.
And they don't really, the only thing that they get out of slavery is the fact that there's somebody lower than them on a social status.
And that's the
No matter how dirt poor they are,
Right.
no matter how many teeth they've lost, they are still above the blacks.
Yes.
And which explains why we see North Carolina regiments in large numbers,
Right.
Tennessee regiments. Because
Mhm.
Tennessee, slave state again though, but very much settled with the Daniel Boone, I'm gonna go out and carve myself a farm out of the wilderness. Which
Right.
doesn't really lend itself to slavery.
You're true.
Um,
I mean,
So-
for a lesser extent, even Arkansas is that way too.
Yes.
They've got the Ozark Mountains in the north.
yeah, I mean, the east side along the Mississippi, very much for cotton.
Sure.
That works great, but, and of course, probably by the Civil War, that was probably the most settled portion.
Yes.
Along the river, Little Rock,
Mm-hmm.
the Arkansas River.
Right. But the thing is again, you're seeing now a split. You're starting to see that split.
Well, you see that tension inside the South.
Right.
And it's hard to explain when you see that difference, that economic difference between a plantation owner and a poor white family in
Oh my
Arkansas. And then and why are they fighting so hard to stay slave states? It doesn't seem like it benefits them at all. But it's part of their own aspiration.
Right.
The aspiration is to build your farm, and in generations maybe you can have a plantation. It becomes the goal, like we talked about with
Yes.
Washington.
Mhm.
Even if he wasn't born into that status, that's what he expected to become.
Yes.
And so you have slavery has now morphed out of just an economic system,
Mhm.
old world,
Yes.
into a racial system, but now a social system as well. And it's solidified to where people in the South who don't even benefit, in fact, are damaged by slavery, see it as a peculiar institution that cannot be taken from their state, which is weird to me.
Yes.
But obviously it happened.
Well, yes, because that's what we're going to talk
Because, I
about
mean,
next week.
I would say what? 75% of the people who died in Pickett's charge were probably poor white Southerners.
more than ever. Which I think is a good place for us to kind of stop right there, because we have reached a good point of how this is all coming together. Again, we have transitioned from being this economic-based slavery to now a social aspect of the way of life.
Yes.
Even if you are a poor white individual
Who doesn't own a slave and never
who
had or will.
who never had owned one, who may have never seen a slave before, you are better than that person because you're white and they're the other lesser group.
Yep, very much so.
And so again, next time we are going to be looking
Well, we could look at the stuff that we touched on the politics,
right.
but that politics spills over into law.
Oh my gosh, yes.
It spills over into the North because, for the most part, somebody in Massachusetts has never been to a southern state. They don't know anybody from a southern state. They could care less. If Georgia fell into the ocean, they wouldn't notice. Except maybe fishing got better.
Yeah.
That's about it. So why does the abolition movement really kick off? And that we'll talk about that and the lead up to the Civil War next time.
Right. All right. Well, thank you again for joining us. Hopefully you will get onto that YouTube page and hit that like button, that subscribe button, and share it with all your friends.
That subscribe button's important because then when a new podcast comes, because we're not really working on a set schedule yet,
Right.
that means you'll get an email that lets you know that there's one waiting.
Great.
So take care.